Hello, my name is Martin Lipscomb and I'm talking today with Associate Professor Miriam Bender. Dr. Bender works at the University of California, Irvine, Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing. Her research focuses on the links or relationality between the organisation of healthcare delivery, multi-professional practice, patient care quality and safety. This programme of research intersects with implementation science, a subject that explores the connectivity between healthcare interventions, the contexts in which they're implemented, and the implementation strategies which are used, including how that connectivity influences healthcare outcomes. Miriam's findings, her work, challenge traditionally assumed beliefs about the stability of health concepts and analyses motivated by what are sometimes called binary notions of healthcare efficacy. Inquiries into the dynamic complexities of healthcare have spurred a philosophic turn in Miriam's scholarship. This turn includes efforts to unpack and critique epistemological and methodological ideas that paradoxically advance determinate theories in a discipline that values commitment to the non-reducibility of the healthcare experience. This effort, Miriam's scholarship, employs process philosophy to make sense of flux and emergence rather than stasis and unity as a driving orientation to the nursing inquiry. And she proposes or advances forms of inquiry with the potential to, in her words, mobilize flux, emergence to achieve disciplinary goals of health and wellness for people, families, and community. Miriam, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. So to kick off, most nurses will be familiar with evidence-based practice and evidence-based nursing. Less, certainly in my experience within the UK, have probably heard or thought about evidence-based management. Miriam, drawing on your interests and experience, how would you, or how might research inform our thinking about and actions concerning nursing leadership?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks, Martin, for inviting me to come talk. This is exciting. First of all, I'd want to distinguish management from leadership. That would be the first thing I would want to do. And second, I would really want to make sure that we don't consider leadership as a thing or a trait or a set of skills. Instead, for me at least, it's more generative to consider it as a process of influencing to achieve goals. So by orienting to leadership as a practice rather than a thing, that already makes this idea of leadership, excuse me, mean things. Excuse me, it makes it more visible, it makes it more observable, because you can actually, observe practices rather than, latent traits in people's heads. And then when you do that observation empirically, you can find out that leadership means things like fostering relationships, exchanging information, and lots of different ways. Managing uncertainty, you can actually see that happen in action. So if you consider leadership as a process, then you also get to do cool things like consider leadership and systems. In Brent James's influential text called Quality Management for Healthcare Delivery, I think that was in 1989 or something like that, he wrote, quote, "A system is a series of interlinked processes which result in outputs." So if you kind of orient to healthcare in that way, you actually can think about studying leadership as a series of practices that create linkages between what might otherwise remain unlinked. And that's how outputs are created, like, for example, places where people want to work and where patients want to be cared for. So practices then can change systems. And to me, really, what better way to think about leadership is doing that. And you can study that. You can observe it, you can model it, you can track its variability across different systems, healthcare settings. You can figure out its dynamics that way. You can hypothesize and test how that can be mobilized. So that's how I think you can research leadership in a way to produce what I call actionable knowledge.
Before we spoke today or now, I suggested to you that for me, leadership was quite a nebulous concept, and you thought it wasn't. Would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, I first was like, nebulous, then what the heck have I been doing for the last 10 years of my life? Because that kind of is my program of research. We were just discussing before this, the way that it really is the way that you orient to a term or a concept or an idea, that's really going to, help you decide what you can and can't do with it. So if leadership is something that's not really thought about much, you were speaking in the UK health system, one of the differences we were talking about is I, for example, teach a required class in leadership and management to the undergraduates and master's level students. It's a 4-unit class that includes a clinical element. So we not only don't think leadership is nebulous, we think of it as something very concrete and a required competency and efficacy for nursing to be able to, pass their NCLEX, their licensing exam, and go out and do good nursing. So, it can be nebulous if you're not orienting it in a way that, it can be operationalized and taught and practiced.
And when you talk about leadership occurring within structures and organizations, do you think it's necessary to have a developed view, which I would think of as a sociological view, about the nature of the social and cultural structures that we work within, a developed view about organizations? And I say this because obviously ideas about these things vary hugely, and incommensurable is a word which is overused, but some of the ways that people think about structure and organization are so different from other ones that perhaps it's sometimes applicable.
Yeah, I like what you said about a sociological approach rather than a, maybe a mental or psychological approach. I mean, I certainly don't orient to leadership as, something, a trait, an inherent trait you either have or don't have. But if you do orient to it that way, then a systems approach doesn't really make sense, does it? Because you either have something or you don't have something. So, can you build it? Can you construct it? Can you interweave it with, with other practices that are going on? So it's important, if you are thinking about it in a more sociological sense, an ecological, modality, maybe, where, it's processes and things and contexts and devices and technologies that are all interacting with each other to produce what we call healthcare. I believe that's really important. I would think that systems thinking in healthcare has become huge, and maybe, has been one of the ways that here, at least in America, we've kind of gotten over that blame culture. Both the hero, the healthcare practitioner is a hero, an individual, making life and death decisions, versus healthcare as a system, bundle of processes, that can go wrong, they can go right. There's ways to look at it from what happened, that made a person's wrong kidney get removed surgically, versus blaming individuals for just not doing the right thing.
So when you're researching into leadership, are you taking a generally, for want of a better phrase, sociological approach to the research that you do?
I had never thought of it that way. I mean, I'm not a sociologist. I'm a nurse. And so I would almost suggest that my orientation to research is the same as my orientation to clinical practice, which is, you have to take a good look around, to even be able to figure out what needs to get done. So, you're taking everything into account. So if we call that sociological, I'll cop to that.
I suppose what I was thinking of is, in certain forms of clinical research, depending upon the type of research that you do, it's possible to make very strong, sometimes quite declamatory claims about what's likely to occur, for example, if you were to do the same thing again. But if you're taking a broadly sociological line through work on leadership, does that change the nature of the claims that you can make regarding leadership?
You would have to define claim a little bit better.
On the basis of research findings that take a broadly sociological line through investigation, does that change the nature of the types of conclusion and what can be built upon the conclusions from that type of research?
Okay, well, if you're asking me about evidence and strength of evidence, is that what you're doing?
Yes, I suppose in some senses, yes.
Okay, well, that's interesting because I don't really think in terms of evidence at all. So I actually think in terms of modeling and models, in a paper that I'm writing about probability logic, the problem with concepts such as evidence or even knowledge per se is that it connotes stability and fixedness, right? You found the inherency in what you've studied. But I mean, when we do research on healthcare delivery, with the goal of determining an effect size, what we're kind of doing is bounding the world into a tightly controlled, set of actions. And then, in a randomized clinical trial, for example, we are then repeating that tight cohesive sequence using a tightly scripted protocol, right? And then we do that until we have what's called an appropriate sample size. And then through statistics, we are determining this number, the probability of the outcome happening, when this tightly controlled set of actions happens, right? And the way that this logic functions, is really only with this underlying assumption that through these scientific methods that we're using, we can attribute, that specific effect size to that set of actions. Like we attribute the color red to a table or, the atomic weight to a molecule there and forevermore. That set of actions has that effect size. But the fundamental logic about all that is that those tightly controlled set of actions are never going to happen again. Once you don't have lots of study investigators telling people exactly what to do and what not to do, and which people to enroll in and which people to say sorry, you don't have the effect size again, because the effect size was only for that specific sequence of events. Something similar, of course, can happen. Of course, we work very hard, to make those set of sequences and actions happen. But, to be quite honest, healthcare is not a thing, it's an event. And so this logic around evidence-based practice to me is just unsound. So the whole idea of a claim, if we're thinking of a claim as evidence, as research, as effect size, I don't think the effect size travels anyway. So why not go about perhaps other ways of studying healthcare and leadership, for example, that might give people descriptions of what's worked in the past, and some ideas of variability within these descriptions, how people have tailored X to make it work in context Y and have still gotten the result that they wanted, which is a reduction in infection rates, et cetera. I don't know if that answered your question.
Together with, I hope I get these names right, together with Marjorie Williams and Wei Su and Lyle Heights, I hope I pronounced that reasonably accurately, you wrote the paper Refining and Validating a Conceptual Model of Clinical Nurse Leader Integrated Care Delivery. And this came out in February 2017 issue of the Journal of Advanced Nursing, and it became very pleasingly one of their most highly cited publications for that year. Now, in that work, you proposed a model of clinical nurse leadership that was trialed, and it was concluded that if used in practice, patient outcomes might be improved. What were the problems or issues with nurse leadership that studies, such as the one I've just mentioned, what do they seek to resolve?
Well, I mean, it just speaks to exactly what we were just talking about. What we proposed was a model right? And then we were thinking about how does, do people think this model works? And so we were just coming about the whole idea of how do you conceptualize and understand nursing in a different way than what we've been doing before in terms of the evidence and an effect size. So I work under an assumption that modeling, and this is a model, and so we were doing modeling, is a pretty valid mode of scientific reasoning that does have the capacity to inform us about the events of the world, but in a way that doesn't rely on those assumptions of predication, stasis, attribution of one thing to another. So, and models, what they can do is they can provide explanations of phenomenon without you having to think that they are like mirroring the phenomenon, that they're representing them. So they're actionable. They're informative. They allow for intelligibility of phenomenon without having to make any claims that X is Y, with this amount of certainty behind it. So, that's what my colleagues and I set out to do. We wanted to model nursing, right? With the goal of learning about what are nursing's dynamics of action, within the context of healthcare organizations, mostly hospitals, is what I've studied up to now. So the paper that you cited was one pretty big study, but in a broader program of research where, we're thinking what is nursing in the context of a model of care? And what we did in that study was we took a model of care that's actually quite popular here in America right now, one that integrates a particular kind of nurse that's doing particular kinds of things. And what we wanted to do is figure out when health systems decide to implement this, how are they doing it? What's going on, and how is what's going on influencing the system and the patient outcomes. So that was kind of our mode into that study. So before that study, we actually had to conceptualize the model, and we did that doing a sort of an ethnography of the literature, so to speak. So that was actually my dissertation project. So once we kind of had this ethnography done, a modeling put forth, we wanted to empirically validate this model. And we did that simply by asking clinicians and administrators to basically tell us if what we conceptualize sounds about right, in their particular health system. We did this across the country. We asked people nationally, and we did, these cool analyses of the data, structural equation modeling, confirmatory factor analysis. And what healthcare workers told us was that this model that we, constructed did do an actual pretty good job of describing their own experience with this model of care. And what was even cooler was we were actually able to put some measurement on this by people were actually able to say the extent to which this conceptualization happened in our health system was linked to a percent of what we called success, success of the model in their health system. So we were able to, quantitatively show that to the extent that these model concepts were in play in their own health systems, the model was successful in achieving what they wanted to achieve, which was their outcomes. So I thought that was really cool, right? And so now what we're doing is we're confirming this in an even larger study that was just funded by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And in this study, we're actually going out to the health systems now. So we're not relying on self-report. We're going out there, we're observing, we're interviewing, we're doing all kinds of things. And the idea is we're looking for the patterns of implementation of this model around the country. And what we want to do is link those patterns to trends in quality and safety outcomes. So we're using other cool methods. We're using interrupted time series. We're using qualitative comparative analysis, doing all kinds of I think really cool methods to be able to figure this out. And what we're hoping to get at the end are causal recipes, not effect size, but causal recipes of model implementation that have been shown to consistently improve the outcomes that people want. So we're trying to figure out what works, how it works, and how it works depending on the specific context the model is implemented in.
From the way you've described it, the purpose of the model was almost descriptive in the first instance, I think, to describe what happens in practice. But do you think there's a problem or an issue with nurse leadership? Is there something which needs to be addressed? What's the problem with nurse leadership?
What's the problem of nurse leadership?
If there's not a problem or an issue, why does the topic merit such attention?
Because, I don't know, do you think healthcare works pretty well in your country? not working very well in ours. You know, we have some of the worst outcomes of the civilized world in terms of, you know, the outcomes of the care that we deliver. So why not, you know, try and think of other ways, new ways of delivering care that actually work? Do I think that nursing can be organized into models of care that work? Yeah, and that's what my program of research is you know, is hypothesizing and finding out.
So models of care and leadership, you're running them together?
Well, once again, I consider leadership a set of practices, right? I consider leadership a practice of influence. I think you could quite easily create you know, a competency for nursing that is leadership. In America, we actually do. The QSIN qualities, the quality, oh, I'm really bad at acronyms. Somehow it stands for something about quality in nursing care. You know, leadership is considered an essential competency. So once again, you know, if leadership can be accrued to nursing, and we consider leadership in nursing as practices that influence outcomes, yeah, then models of care fit that logic perfectly. How do you organize those practices in ways that consistently produce outcomes?
In collaboration with David Holmes, you've written about reconciling nursing's art and science, and you define that as a dualism, the dualism of art and science. Would you say a little bit about this dualism? And within clinical settings, how might these twin dimensions or aspects of nursing play out or make themselves felt, particularly, obviously, with regard to leadership? How do clinical nurse leaders facilitate nursing practice as an art and also as a science?
Well, I'd like to get over the idea of nursing as an art and a science. So that's what that paper that Dave and I worked on, you know, that was what the argument was. You know, the dualism is this idea that nursing functions in two very different worlds, right? One world that's out there already filled with things and stuff that can be identified and studied and manipulated, you know, kind of like what we've been talking about. And science is a good practice for doing so. But we also believe that there is another world as well, you know, the one that's not out there, not pre-existing, but that's created and expressed through our practice, our art, the art of nursing. And both worlds, you know, you read the literature, you talk to nurses, and we feel that both are very real to us, that they both exist, that they're assumed to be irreducible. You know, we won't ever be able to bucket the art into the science or the science into the art. They are distinct, right? They are polar. And I don't know. And what this boils down to, though, for me, is that nursing has then, you know, puts itself in the business of constantly sorting, you know, reality into that which can be authorized by science, and that has to be negotiated into practice. And I think that there's consequences, serious consequences to that. One, the least of which is the continued frustration in defining our practice, what is nursing, in ways here, at least in America, that's authoritative in prescribing its own organization within health systems, right? For example, we now have economists and chief financial officers defining nursing practice in the context of hospitals, rather than us doing, rather than us doing it because of, I think, this accepted dualism. And it's a problem. It's one I'd like to get past. It's one reason I'm doing that program of empirical research. I want to get to some authoritative findings that we can deliver to health system leaders and say that, this is the way you should organize nursing because look, it works. It achieves what you want it to. Rather than just thinking nursing is a really expensive thing for hospitals to have to shell out dollars for. And so I'm doing it that way, but, dualism is not just me saying this. It's not just nursing saying this. This is actually a pretty standard assumption all over the world and in philosophy as well. So I decided I needed to go to the philosophical literature to help me out here. What does philosophy have to offer other than Cartesian dualism? This idea of, mind and matter, object, subject, etc. And what I found was what one philosopher, continental philosopher Deleuze calls, quote, a secret school of philosophy. So it's this philosophy of event or process philosophy. And I started reading this literature and it really, to be quite honest, made a lot of sense to me, even though I still can't say that I understand it completely, but it's very complex. But let's summarize it quite easily as a mode of orienting to the world that doesn't require bifurcation. Now, what does that look like? How can you even, how can you do that? Well, some of these process philosophers are writing to the effect that the world or reality or existence, can actually be conceived of as flux, as eventful processes and not static things, which is a lot of what we, in common sense do. And things, if we orient to flux, as what there is out there, then, what are things? Well, things can be considered effects of these processes, which then become the conditions for other processes, which then could have similar effects, i.e. there it is again, or different effects, Kuhn's, paradigm shifts, depending on the interweaving of other processes with their own effects, etc. So if you think about it this way, in this way, the world, kind of like what I was thinking before empirically, it becomes a network bundle of processes, a dynamic system that's always in play. So if you think about the world this way, it's actually really much easier to account for nursing and nursing leadership in a very cohesive manner, because nursing then becomes just considered part of the world that's considered as interdependent dynamic relations in which nursing interacts, to constitute possibilities for health and positive health trajectories. It kind of, it actually makes sense, or at least it does to me. And to bring it back to nursing and leadership, if we already consider leadership as a practice, which I've, tried to convince you of, we can mobilize process philosophy to help us illustrate how this practice, our practice, nursing, constitutes our unique efficacy, which is different than claiming what our inherent essence is. So if we think about it this way, nurses, we're not working with objects such as patients or technology. We're actually doing, something a lot cooler. We're working with actually that which doesn't yet exist and helping to bring it into existence is one way we can think about ourselves. Our goal is different realities. We want our patients actually having different experiences at the end of our shift. It's like literally as simple as that. We want their pain levels to drop. We want them to be walking rather than lying in bed. We want them understanding, what they didn't understand before in terms of, what's happening to them and their care. And one way that I've been putting it recently is that nursing is about a trust in putting ourselves into problematic situations without any known solutions. And our unique efficacy is the work that we do, nursing, to co-create these possibilities for health that literally didn't exist at the beginning of the shift. So, nursing in this light can be considered almost like this. It's a way to really showcase and illuminate and illustrate how nursing is actually a needed contrast to medicine or health science, because we focus precisely on what medicine and traditional science reject, right? These problematic situations without an inherent solution. And that's where our unique efficacy lies. We work at the limits where traditional knowledge or objects cease to operate. We all of a sudden become in play when the ventilator doesn't work, when the surgery goes bad, when all of a sudden things aren't happening the way they should. And, and that's how we work. We create new possibilities or new realities for health. So there's process and nursing and leadership for you in a nutshell.
Miriam, that was really interesting. Thank you very much. And I shall endeavour not to think of leadership as a nebulous concept ever again. Thanks for being here today.
All right. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.